So, Stephen, I've known you for over 20 years now. And since I've known you, you have been working as a facilitator, a coach, an educator, a mentor. You've worked with private individuals and families. You've worked with businesses and organizations. You've done mediation. You've done conflict resolution. You have had a really broad scope of experience in basically in human relationship. What ties all this together? What has been your central organizing theme over the years?
Wow, that's a great question, and one would think that I would have had that in the forefront of my awareness. In the most broadest. That's a really nice way to say something. in an abstract way, it's about love. It's about a love of humanity. It's about a learning to fall in love with life, falling in love with the world, and additionally, it seems that that's the flag I'm here to carry, is to work with people to further their ease, to have them awaken within this play or this drama of humanity, and then I think at some point to awaken from the dream. But that's another story. Am I answering you?
So it sounds like relationship is relationship across many applications in our lives. And I also have noticed that the tools that you bring to work with this, early on, like when I knew you 20 years ago, you were already well established in your field, and you used things, there were organizational dynamics and neuro-linguistic programming and family constellations and things that were considered maybe even fringe back then, but they've been embraced by professionals around the world now, and they're pretty mainstream. So what's new for you? You seem to work right on the edge. You're pushing the envelope of how people relate, of personal growth. And what's new for you now? What are you bringing this into?
What's new, I think, is me. That any work that I've done throughout my work with people that started a number of years before I met you was all predicated on my own level of development. And what I could do throughout the years was simply dependent on my own evolvement, my own unfolding. And I am utterly a different person now, not the same man I was even a few months ago. And another aspect of what's new has to do with my facility in working with invisible systems and helping people change. I view people as being quite distinct from what is commonly regarded as a person. In the years ago when NLP was or neuro-linguistic programming was my fundamental model, in those days we talked about it making neurological change, and the assumption was we were working quite directly through the senses with neurology. Now, having been in constellations and also a subject called Sente energetics, now I see that no, even in NLP we were working with energetic invisible structures that would impact the neurology. In family systems, I work more directly with these invisible fields and the structural connections between people and circumstance and ease or difficulty. And my capacity to do that has simply expanded and expanded. And again, I have a question because I'm speaking about things that a lot of people may not be familiar with. I was going to ask, am I making sense? But before I end here, I want to say that you as a woman have abilities that a lot of girls and women have, and all women have naturally, whether they retain that or not. And that's the ability to know things that most men would regard as their intellectually indefensible knowing. In other words, you have a way of perceiving a reality from whether some man is thinking about you or giving you attention. I know you personally, you sense it. And you can sense other circumstances going on around you that the majority of we men are utterly clueless of. So there's a way in which girls and women, unless they turn it off, know things. Well, this way of working with, whether it was with systemic or family constellations, or working more with the seeing and the invisible, that's just an expansion of what you do naturally and that you've retained. So maybe that's clarifying, and you can, again, I'm going to say, am I answering your question?
Yes, that was a great answer. And it leads me to another question. So I heard you say that men and women operate somewhat differently. And as recently as only maybe even 10 or 15 years ago, that would have been politically incorrect. However, the field of neurology has come a long way in showing that, yeah, we are wired a little differently when it comes to gender, although each gender is all over the map regarding that wiring. And I heard you say that we could turn that off. So what does that have to do with the way we relate to each other as humans, both professionally, privately, in groups, as couples or relationships? What is that switch, turning it on, turning it off? What does that mean to us?
I'm assuming that the word "that" and the word "it" refers to the sensibilities or the sixth sense that women possess, and it's turning it off. Well, a boon for the workplace is when a woman turns it off, she'll behave more like a man in the workplace. And male-modeled patriarchal workplaces don't want the inconvenience of all the things that women will know or bring to the party. And they will want the woman to work more like a man because in these models, this is what is effective or generates the most revenue for certain numbers of people. Personally, when a woman sets aside her relationship with a feminine gender essence, which is distinct from that way of perceiving, and she aligns herself more with a masculine gender essence, it costs her personally, it costs her physiologically. We men can have a lot more testosterone in our systems than women. And when women need to work more like men, they're taxing their systems to make more testosterone. And if she's still menstruating, then her ovaries and her adrenals are producing the testosterone so she can go. But it's very taxing to her hormonal system. If she's past menopause, her ovaries are not producing testosterone, but it leans heavily on her adrenals, and then she's going to burn out faster. So health-wise, it's a problem for the woman personally. And of course, that will impact her family life. On a different scale, with the way our world is working now, the knowledge and information that we predicate everything on is past tense. And yet a woman's way of knowing, she knows something that is in real time, and there's constantly new information that she relates if she stays in touch with that knowing that she senses in her experience. And even though she may not be able to articulate the cause of something, she knows immediately whether a plan will be effective or whether it will work or not. No one knows how she knows this, but she knows this. And from one who can see a little bit into the invisible, she's simply seeing through what we call time and seeing how things unfold. And yet nobody listens to her because what she has to say is not rational. And another thing about when a woman has a tighter relationship with feminine gender essence, she naturally is inclusive and joins others and participates and is collaborative and thinks in ways that are in service to people. Whereas left to our own devices, we typically think of one thing and we're rather goal-directed. Either we're going towards something quite seriously or away from something else quite seriously, and we don't attend, and we create a lot of collateral damage, and we don't perceive all the variables involved, even if we're pretty keen.
So, so while these skills tend to be somewhat gender related, can we learn them? Can we turn that switch on to be more sensitive to what's going on around us, to be able to kind of suss out the clues that women, or some people, I've seen men do it too, can just seem to pull out of the environment, the group they're in, the people they're working with, or what I've heard you call non-ordinary experience, that intuition that some of us have. How can we learn and improve and hone that skill? Is it teachable?
You ask about whether one can learn greater awareness. Yeah, we can, and I'm proof. I used to be utterly oblivious to much of what would go on around me. I mean, I worked as a cop through my university training and beyond, and so I developed the capacity to have greater acuity and watch what's going on around me. And then with my NLP training, a part of that process is learning and really developing sensory acuity. And yet what you're referring to is distinct from our five senses. And this firstly comes from an awareness development, not only an awareness of the facts and circumstances politically or economically or socially around the world, but becoming a awareness of oneself and the impact that one has, or that how I affect others around me, and being aware of their responses to me. And that starts with sensory acuity, but there's a leap. All of us have the capacity, and all of us actually experience and see one another entirely, but because of our upbringing and training, we have learned to deny our knowing, and the denial occurs before the level of consciousness. So our awareness and our experience and our knowing is shut off before it ever reaches our conscious awareness. And so part of that is involved in activities or practices or being around people who are really good at perceiving, and then they themselves experience, oh, my awareness is slightly expanding. I'm experiencing something that I wasn't aware of previously. Now, one of my former colleagues in Amsterdam had a model for teaching heightened perception, non-ordinary perception. Sente Energetics teaches heightened perception. When I do and have done my lengthy trainings for teaching systemic or family constellations, one of my goals was having people participate me through time and allow their awareness to unfold and develop. Because in the process of doing those constellations, people realized that they were aware, they were perceiving non-ordinary things and things that are intellectually indefensible. Like their brain would go, I can't know this, and yet they do know this. And so that process I really valued for that. And that was part of my intent, was having people increase their awareness, because we are not whatever it is we think we are, nor is life what we think it is. And it's important to have those awakenings and those awarenesses so that we can do what we're here to do, but also have relationships that support one another and further support our own and one another's confidence, so that we can be more creative and have a richer, fuller life. And there's more beyond, but I want to stop there.
That's a fascinating concept, that those are awarenesses that we have, and we just have to wake up to them. And I've heard you refer to waking up before. In this age of misinformation and things, people subscribing to conspiracy theories and dismissing science and all of the different stories that are coming up, and people subscribing to them as stories, have led me to the idea that that's where we live. We live in stories. And I think I've heard you say that we're acculturated early on. And so part of that acculturation is to turn off that switch, if you will, of awareness, of our own awarenesses in our own body, and to kind of drop out of the thinking where that culture lives, the things that we've been taught, all that lives, and drop down, metaphorically, drop down into our body to harvest the sensations and the knowings that are there and probably have always been there. Is that kind of a representation of what you're saying? And how can we wake up to understand the stories that we're living in, that we create for ourselves unconsciously? How can we find those and come to truth?
In response to you, I want to say that your use of the word concept, a concept that we have these senses and that we switch them off, it's a concept to the academic world, to the mind that stays entrained to what the system wants it to believe. I know for you personally, and I know for myself, and everyone who actually does see and have direct experience of non-ordinary, or a direct experience of what goes on in themselves, it is not a concept. It is an absolute reality that's tangible, that's visible, that's audible, and on and on. And your example by using that term is kind of the condition of our world. We've been entrained to refuse our subjective experience, whether it's a direct sensory experience or a non-ordinary sensory experience, and we substituted it with psychological experience. And the bent is that we subordinate all subjective experience. That's part of the entrainment in our culture, so that we have psychological experience, but it's not our own. It comes from an inner subjectivity amongst the culture we live in. Now, in my world, there is no objective reality. There are subjective experiences, and that are ordinary and non-ordinary. There's an intersubjective experience that we live, and wherein we vibrate with the memes and mores around us, and we consent to and accept as what's real is what the vast majority of people believe, rather than what is true in our own subjective experience. Now, I talked about the value of subjective experience, and I mean that in a way that is bent on the good, true, and beautiful. Now, one of my teachers used to use the expression, the majority of human beings live imaginally. In other words, we live in our imagination rather in our direct sensory and non-sensory experience of life. And who is that guy that second chapter, opening sentence in the second chapter of his second book said, the human condition, lost in thought. Oh, that's Eckhart Tolle. We're lost in thought. Well, the reality is, as human beings, we are utterly subject to influence of circumstance going on around us. If we see something constantly or hear something constantly, and it can even be a one-off event, things get into us, and we believe that they are ourselves, or there's a legitimacy to what we're aware of, and then we start believing things that are false to fact reality, and we carry on acting as though we are true, and we are convinced in our experience. So there are lots of people leveling a lot of theories nowadays, and it's problematic. Now, there's another thing going on that in the military it was called psychological operations. That's where military, when they come in, they might make a lot of noise with crazy loud music, or when they have prisoners of war that they want to interrogate, they keep them awake and have loud music, or the way it plays out is that an event happens and they publish what factually happened, and then they publish another point of view, and another cause, and another cause, and another cause, so none of us know what to believe. And we'll read or see different stories about an event, and and because of whatever underlying bent or something we have inside ourselves, we'll settle on one of these and believe it's factual and disbelieve the others. And that's the real pandemic of our times, or one of the real pandemics of our times. And so people believe, well, you need to wear a mask now, or people believe, no, that takes my rights away. And it exacerbates the circumstance of our life. And my interest in subjective experience is separating oneself as much as possible from the input from out there, and orienting with a part of one yourself inside that is body-centered and grounded, and something that's devoid of any intellect, that is an experience of what is genuine for this self. If he or she were to set aside everything that I've learned, and to open that kind of an awareness, that's what intrigues me. That's what furthers not only humanity, but it furthers enabling us to do what I think we're here for.
So I've watched you apply some of your skills, both privately and with individuals and in groups over the years, and I have seen you demonstrate a remarkable degree of success. And I personally attributed it to not only the tools that you brought to the table that are commonly used in relationship counseling, coaching, personal growth, but also the non-ordinary sensory experience, the cues and clues that your awarenesses bring you, that you simply bring to the attention of other people. And as soon as you bring it to their attention, they seem to get it. And can you talk a little more about the non-ordinary experiences that you experience, that you've taught, that you've made me aware of, even more aware of, and how you apply them, how they're relevant?
Yeah, and I want you to give me an example, a specific example, and I'll use that to cue off to give you a great response. I don't know what it is yet, but it'll be great.
In some of the earlier seminars that you did, you used a family constellation organization around the problem solving that you did. And some of the things that came up were literally problems with people that were not in the room. I mean, there was many of the things that were brought to you had to do with challenges in interpersonal relationships, where the representatives weren't even there. And still, you created a circumstance where they were thoroughly and believably, palpably represented in the room, so that the circumstances could be solved. What is that about? How did you do that? That was almost miraculous in the results that you achieved.
I really like what you're asking, and I'm going to answer that question later. What I want to hear from you is, you ask about the non-ordinary regarding personal work. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people are doing constellation work, and some of them are very good, and some of them are, and they're working in the non-ordinary way, and some are simply doing it more psychologically. And some people won't know the difference. And I want to go with your question, but there's something else that I think wants to be said, and it will come from a personal, ask me about a personal example.
Just by way of example, in my own personal life, I brought some family issues to you which had been present in my family since before some of my siblings were even born. And after my mother died, I had issues around a trust that was created and the dissemination of her belongings and assets, and kind of negotiating in our family circle to make this work for everybody. I really wanted consensus, and I really wanted everything to be done as my mother intended and out of love. And there was some contention in our group, and I brought this. And we were not only able to resolve it amicably, but I felt that after that, I had a lot of support from the other family members for whatever we did. And we really pulled together and came together. And I attribute that directly to the work that you did with me. So how did you bring that about? How could that happen? Just turned it completely around.
Thank you for being specific. I can answer that.
Yeah, it's easier.
One of the things that happens when I work with people or listen to them talking, if I so choose, I can direct my awareness and my attention in such a way where I can see what's going on within the system of a self and the systems that they are a party to. And often I see what to me looks like little filaments that I can follow from you that connect to other people or circumstance or institutions or culture. One of my teachers described the mechanics of the energetic attachments or connections as being very similar to the old-fashioned telephone operator, where they were women that would sit in front of a circuit board and plug in cables and unplug. And that fitted very much what I saw about these connections, because I would unplug them. And I would do that indirectly. And so we are all, and energy itself is a metaphor in this context, but we're all energetically connected to biological family members, our adult family, to the places where we work, to the cultures, and to our race, on and on and on. And there are all these little filaments that connect, and some of them connect us to people or circumstances or events that create drag on our system, and are heavily weighted, so that there's a drag or a gravity that keeps us from lifting or propelling our lives forward. And so in the case when I work with groups of people, I see those dynamics, and I have other people stand out and represent certain individuals and characters, and they too have awarenesses of the connections. But yet I can do the same thing individually without other people. I can see this. And so when I work with your system, there's simply a series of connections attachments that I remove, or connections that are not yet firm attachments that could change, and I unplug some and plug some into the other. There are also acknowledgments that acknowledge and honor some circumstance or event. And I'm going to take a little more time in responding to this. That if you've ever thought of or seen singing bowls, whether they're brass or crystal, and when they're struck with a mallet, or a mallet is dragged around the top, typically they vibrate and utter a sound. Well, think for a moment, if the sound or the vibration was impeded, that there could be no vibration or utterance of sound. All that force from that mallet is contained in that bowl. We're similar. Whatever it is we are, and with our lives, the forces of life blow through us, and when circumstances and events happen around us that are disconcerting or traumatic or problematical, unless we are capable to have a proper utterance to express the impact of that trauma on us and clear it, it's retained in the system, and we are entangled with that event or people involved, and we carry that with us through time, and we go through our lives attempting we say things and do things that are an attempt to clear that event or trauma, but they're ineffective. Because we don't know specifically what it is, because of the way our mind operates is that goes into our unconscious awareness. So we forget to remember. We know we're troubled, but we don't know the source. Nor do we know the right expression. And what working whether it's in constellations in a group or with somebody like me individually, that can go in and look at causal events and find those connections and disconnect them, then people are free. Am I making any sense? Now I want to say something else about this. Often when, not always, but often when someone is raped, whether it's a man or woman, typically it's women, there is a place where everything inside them freezes. Psychologically they freeze, their body freezes where they cannot utter a sound perhaps, or they can't move, but energetically they freeze too. So that in that moment, for whatever drives that sense of freezing, maybe it's a survival thing, there is literally no way to express and release. And release her angst or her pain or the indignity of the assault or the brutality, whatever it is. And any kind of trauma, or whether someone else would think it's traumatic or not, when we experience a trauma, particularly one that is wholly unexpected, it finds purchase in it, and we are often prohibited from the expression, culturally, socially, or if you ever had the tragedy of watching a parent tell his 7-year-old daughter, "Oh, you're not supposed to cry. We don't cry here." We're trained to shut up, to not express when it's of utter importance. And the same goes for grief. We don't know how to deal with grief because we're not permitted to express ourselves.
Stephen, I loved what you said about the circuit board as metaphor. That's a wonderful metaphor for my culture, the culture I live in. It's a good metaphor. A metaphor is really kind of all we have talking about things like this, because we don't have the facility, the words even, in our language to address these things. But they're common in indigenous cultures. Many cultures around the world, and even the ones that are, even some of those in other places, Asia and Europe, which are quite modern cultures now, have words and have ways of addressing. They acknowledge by their words these non-ordinary experiences. We can't even acknowledge them in our culture. And that in itself restricts our thinking, I believe. So to work around this, I mean, this is a challenge. This has got to be tough for you. How can you get people to experience, these non-ordinary experiences and use these, drop into being able to clear the trauma and the burden that we carry, which are, some of them are cultural, some of them are personal, like grief and loss, or physical trauma, like the example that you used. How can we access these tools if we don't have the words, but we still bear the burden of common experiences across humanity?
Firstly, there is not a language that's adequate to talk about these things. And yes, I do talk about it metaphorically. And I can do a really good job when I'm one-on-one with people, when they want to know what I do. I'll ask them what they do, and then I'll make assumptions about what they must understand in order to do what they do, and then I fit a metaphor to what they do. However, I've been utterly unsuccessful in coming up with a metaphor that I can broadcast and appeal to a lot of people, because there isn't the language, and our cultures deny this kind of genuine experience. It doesn't. It's not in a culture's best interest to have people to be free to be genuinely themselves. And there's something else you asked me that I'm forgetting. So if this is a good place to ask.
That we didn't have a common language, that we have common burdens like trauma and things, and being able to address them without the language. And I also spoke about how Indigenous peoples have the language and are able to recognize the things that you do and have words for this, these experiences that that we can dip into.
You also asked something about other cultures having language. It's true, there are vestiges of people who have awareness, who do perceive what I call the non-ordinary. And yet a lot of those don't come to me to work, I mean, occasionally, because they have effective means generally to work with issues. I mean, there is some ease going to Asia where people are familiar with the reality and concept of chi, what they call chi, in other words, energy. So they will listen to me. Typically, like I said before, it's either word of mouth gets people to me so I can help them with, be the pain relief person. Other times, in companies, I've had investors go to their CEOs and say, look, I've got $20 million in this organization and you're going to work with this guy. And those execs are a lot of fun until they realize that something of value is happening. Just a second, there's something else here that wants to be said that's really related to your question. I guess I want to speak to what I've come to believe wants to happen for people on the planet. People, I think, whatever it is that we are, come here and become people, and we're here for some purpose of being utterly and irrevocably changed. And I don't mean that in a physical evolutionary sense, because that happens by itself. Because who we are, whether people call it an essential self or spirit, those things don't evolve. They may expand or change. Whatever it is that we are is both personal and transpersonal. And the personal parts of us have issues that are always of a mind to mend to my heart. And so we come here to be changed, and the metaphor is DNA only changes under pressure. So as people, we're exposed to varying degrees of pressure for the purpose of changing us. And when an issue presents in my life, for example, a death of, well, in this case, my late wife, that occurred with a bent to fix something in the system of self that for eons has been unwell. And in that process of going through a major loss, the structures of the self that I unwittingly created and was bequeathed were utterly annihilated. And then something else is here now. And this happens to be my incarnation, my life. Somebody else, it may be that they are provided opportunity after opportunity, but it didn't fit their model of the world to lighten, load, or mend themselves, and they leave this life without things resolved. Other people, and that's their path. And so what I'm indirectly pointing at is each of us individually need to have a personal cosmology or an overarching story of all things that is supportive of the life we live, rather than limiting or making us wrong or whatever. And I think I'm answering you. And if I'm incomplete, do a follow-up question. I want to speak to this thing about personal cosmology or is it overarching or overarching? Whatever the right word is, story of all things, that essentially we're bequeathed and acculturated into a story of all things. Our personal cosmology typically is one that's handed to us, or in addition to being handed to us, I think it's an imprint that we receive at conception, and it comes from one of either our mother's line or ancestors. And this is all unconscious, and part of the task of altering our personal cosmology, the one bequeathed to us, I think for some people they become aware of it as children or adolescents, And then I think there's a major opportunity somewhere around 28 or 29, and I don't speak astrology, but those people say there's something about a return. But there's about a 3-year period there where I've watched people be presented with circumstance, and they either choose a path of their own creation or they follow the one that they were given by their family. And at that period, it's all about what's our personal cosmology, because our story of all things is what we predicate our lives on, whether we know it or not. And if life's a bitch and then you die, you predicate your experience on that. If when Paul Richards passed on a story of all things, something it's terrible and wonderful, and I'm for it. That is a beautiful story of all things, because there's profound beauty that has no upper limit, and there's profound difficulty that has no upper limit, and joy and ease and pain and no limits on any end. So something it's terrible and wonderful, and I'm for it. That is a beautiful personal cosmology. Now, I have been incorporating that into myself and have revised my own, and yet there are always vestiges that, because the culture's in the concrete and in the atmosphere, so there's always vestiges of this other stuff until such time the ego falls away and falls away and falls away. But what we guide our life by, philosophically or spiritually, gives us our experience, and the meaning we derive from the experience thus becomes our experience, our psychological experience.
So what you just said brings to mind my earlier reference of how we live in a story. And the story that we've created for ourselves, that we live in, also comes with limitations which we have created, and which we can change if we realize that we're living in that story. So you've been a direct cause of my own changing cosmology throughout my life. I'm having to change it because of things that I've seen and experienced and actually watched you do. I know when you were first doing family constellations, that was magic to me until you taught me how to do a little of it. And I thought, oh, I understand how this works. I understand how light bulbs work and radios work and telephones work, and no one knows what electricity is really yet. But we don't have to understand the nuts and bolts of it in order to wield it as a tool. And you have developed to the point where every time I see you, I think you're doing magic because I don't understand it yet. And you've become a lot more astute, a lot more powerful in your perception. And so what do you think brought you to this point? How did you develop these skills that you're applying literally to world problems and personal problems and the challenges that we face as humans?
It had to do with me opening up to a wholly different model of the world and on an entirely different cosmology. I grew up in a pretty provincial, pedestrian, myopic rural community in middle America, where I used to say that I described those people as a place where values run deep and minds run narrow. And I used to say that pejoratively. I still think that way about them, but it's not pejorative, and I'm also wrong. I mean, there are some people's like that and some people not. My first divorce, there was an opening in that divorce, and that the woman I was married to spoke 5 languages, was a accomplished musician with a French horn and classical piano, valedictorian, summa cum laude, 4.0 graduate student, yada, yada, yada. Anything she wanted to do, she could do brilliantly. That was not what I was brought up to believe how women are. And she was soft and feminine, and brilliantly clever, bright. That shattered my constructs. When she and I had owned this house, there was a playful ghost in the house that would move her dish towel from at different parts of the kitchen, just playing with her. And we had a little puppy, it would jump up on it. And when she would comment to me, I would say something like, "That thing doesn't exist." And then I started seeing them myself, some other place, some other time. My realities are being shattered. At the same time, I started learning, this is an important piece. I worked my way through university as a cop, and back in those days, police were less militarized, or at least where I was. Cops behaved a little more honorably. I'm sure there's still those there. But there was a moment where I went to a call, and a man had an automatic weapon. He was firing around in a restaurant, and I was the only guy available in that neighborhood. And by the time I got there, he was out back behind a building, and he had a weapon in his hand, and I had my weapon trained on him, and I was giving him commands, and he wasn't responding. And in those days, I carried a revolver, and I had my trigger halfway pulled in case I had to kill the guy. And in that moment, between the person and my weapon, a field opened up, and I saw image after image after image of alternative courses of action, meaning I did not have to kill the guy. And I chose one of those, and I holstered my weapon and effected an arrest. And there was a minor injury, but nothing serious. The guy didn't get hurt. And I had no place for that. And so I set it aside and forgot it until later. Well, I think in the late 90s, my wife and I started studying it, going to Peru and working with the Caro Indians, learning their approach to dealing with energy and the energy of life and nature. At that time also, I started studying family systems with people who had been trained by Hellinger, and then with him himself. And so my world started opening, my ability to perceive started expanding, because I was having all these experiences that both working with the Peruvians that I couldn't deny, and working in constellations. In the first 5 years I did constellations, every moment I saw exactly what needed to happen, and I would stand out there in the room working, and my brain would go, "That doesn't make any sense." But the only way I could be effective is stop listening to my thoughts and do what I saw and perceived in the field. And then about 11 years ago, I started working with Sente Energetics, where their capacity to see into the non-ordinary was brilliant. And they also followed a path where they have to have second independent verifications of what you see, so that you stay out of your imagination. And so my ability to see just expanded and expanded. So, and it can happen for anyone, but I happen to simply be that's been my path. Other people have different paths.
So regarding applying it to the needs of humans cross-culturally, you've taken those things that you can see, have actually trained yourself to see better and feel better, to apply to the burdens that everybody carries just as humans. I know that you work in Europe, and not only in the U.S., but also in Europe and in Asia and in the Mediterranean, literally around the world. So apparently, and does this transfer that easily to other cultures? I mean, it seems to be language independent. Are there cultures that grok this more quickly or more easily than we do in the U.S.? And what does that ability to communicate that those skills, those listening, feeling, sensory, non-ordinary experience skills, I would say, like, who gets it easiest and why, and how can we get it more easily here? How can we learn those things more easily?
And it's true, I've worked in Europe and Asia and around the Med and a little bit in the Middle East. And a lot of places, it used to be I'd be interviewed in those countries, and they always want to know what's the difference. And I'd say I'd rather talk about the similarities.
Yeah.
There are some cultural differences, and some of them run more deeply than others. But as people, I consistently see similarities in how we process, how we experience, and the issues that trouble us. I think I've worked in 21 countries, and the issues that trouble us are the same. There were times when I've worked with groups of physicians, and my task with them is first I meet them in their intellect, and once I meet them there, then I can move them and meet them in their heart, and then we can begin to work. That's a little analogous to working with groups of people. If they're a group that they need to be met in their intellect, I'll meet them in their intellect, and then I'll move them to the human part of them. And if there's enough rapport, then I can begin to do something with energy, and enough of them will perceive it, or they'll see that their friends or colleagues are perceiving it. Then they're curious. I was doing a presentation in the UK a few years ago, and there were about 60 business people in the room, maybe 25 women, and the rest guys. And I started out talking to the women about all the things they could perceive that men couldn't. And the women are going, yes, yes, I know that, yes. And all the women are, yes, I know that. And I could just watch the men. What is this that they know that I don't? Because men and women who think they're bright, but for men who think we're bright, if we haven't experienced or haven't heard about it, it's probably not worth knowing, or it isn't real. And so when the rest of the men in the room, I provoked their curiosity, because all these women knew something that their women colleagues that these guys didn't know, and so it got them curious, and then we could begin the process. So of having them to see the dynamics going on energetically in their own company, and I do something with their company and demonstrate to them what these people and myself shouldn't know, but we do know. And they have enough hints about it to realize there's some veracity in what's happening here. Then they become open.
So I heard you say that you needed to get the people that you work with to shift from an intellectual understanding, that story, and maybe even that, whatever cosmology they subscribe to, into the heart, a more heart-centered awareness. And anyone who has followed like yoga or some martial arts, anyone who does Qigong or has followed some of those disciplines understands the heart-centered, the body-centered awarenesses a little better, I think. But then we compartmentalize that, and when we're not actually doing that, we set it aside and we go on about our life. That's the first part of the question, is how can we be less compartmentalized and live in a more heart-centered way? What are we listening for? What are we looking for? And the second part of the question is, corporations, organizations, cultures, do they have heart-centered awareness? Can they be heart-centered? Do they have a heart? And how do we live such that we can bring heart to the groups in which we organize ourselves as human beings? How can we function with heart in those groups? Companies, organizations, corporations, family units. How can we be heart-centered?
When I answered the question and used get somebody from their intellect to their heart, in those moments when I was with physicians or with business people, I was actually talking about getting them out of their professional persona into their personage. Yeah. Wanting to hear from the person. One time I was working with a group of county commissioners, and I interviewed each of them individually at first, and I asked one a question, and I said, okay, now I heard from the commissioner, or I heard from the politician, I want to hear from you. And they would answer me and essentially say something, and I said, well, now I've heard from the administrator, now I want to hear from you. And most of them would just freeze. They were unaware of the distinction between professional personas, the politician or the administrator, and there was no self there. And it's hugely common with professional people or business people that to succeed in business, they become the persona, and then they no longer have a relationship not only with themselves, so that they don't have a relationship with their body, particularly women. And the trouble is that then they come home and the family gets the persona, the business person or the worker, instead of the parent, the person. And so often, and my goal was around the Mediterranean, mostly women would come up and they'd say, well, I want to feel like a woman again. And they weren't hitting on me or doing anything weird. They were stuck not feeling the way that they wanted to feel as people, as women. And I would say, well, I get it. What's standing in front of me is a professional persona. You don't know who you are. You don't know your body. You've not been giving to your body. You've not been giving to the woman. And often when I would work with them, as I have them establish a relationship and help them find themselves, I took their persona away. Instead of having the businesswoman go to work, I'd have the woman to go to work with all the skills of the businesswoman. And she brings a lot more. And so that little motion alone, that's not so little, is a way of getting more heart-centered. Because as people, then we have our issues and our desires and our dreads, and those things are personal. Well, what's my sense in this? What do I love? What do I want and need? Emotionally, psychologically. And that is a movement toward the heart. Another thing is getting people away from when politicians or business people, instead of giving prepared scripts, talk extemporaneously. The reason they all have scripts is to prevent them from telling the truth of their experience. And they tell us something that's plausible to believe, but it's not real for them. And so having people be extemporaneous in their lives instead of preparing, just relax in your body and move toward being genuine. The heart will come to the fore. The pain may as well, but then you deal with it, and yeah. So I think we're done here. I'm really, really grateful and heartened for who you are and how you are, so that you could interview me in the way that you did. It's brilliant, and it works for me, and hopefully something came through that did so because of how you are with me. I'm heartened for you, Dennis, and I'm heartened to have this audience, and thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I really appreciate the ability to explore this with you and to find out a little bit more about what gives you juice, and what makes things really work, and how you've made things really work for me and for other people, not only in my circle, but around the world. Thank you. Thanks for who you are and how you show up. Appreciate it.